Bullies try to tear the teacher's blouse in class. She makes them pay. Rowan Blackwell adjusted her simple navy blouse, standing outside Lincoln High School in Denver. She possessed an unremarkable appearance. Average height, brown hair in a practical ponytail, wire-rimmed glasses, and a slender frame that made her appear fragile. Her modest clothing reflected her quiet nature. What none of her colleagues knew was that beneath her unassuming exterior lay 8 years of mixed martial arts training. Rowan had earned her black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and developed devastating striking skills in Muay Thai at Denver's most respected MMA gym. She could break boards with her bare hands, but kept her two worlds separate. Teaching literature was her true passion. Lincoln High School's red brick buildings housed 36 classrooms. Rowan's classroom, 204B, sat at the end of the second-floor hallway, isolated from the busier sections where veteran teachers held court. Her second week at Lincoln began with cautious optimism. Students shuffled into her third-period American literature class, backpacks heavy with textbooks they rarely opened. "Good morning, everyone," Rowan said softly. "Please take out your copies of To Kill a Mockingbird. We'll be discussing Chapter 3 today." A snicker erupted from the back corner, where Braden Morrison had established his unofficial throne. Tall and broad-shouldered from varsity football, Braden commanded attention through sheer physical presence and arrogance that came from being the principal's nephew. His blonde hair was styled perfectly, and expensive brand names set him apart from classmates. Flanking him sat Colton Hayes, a wiry basketball player with calculating eyes, and Jackson Turner, whose father owned the county's largest construction company. "Yo, Miss Blackwell," Braden called out, deliberately mispronouncing her name as Blackhole. "Why we gotta read this old garbage? Nobody cares about some dead guy's book." Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the challenge in his tone. Rowan had faced similar situations during her student teaching, but something about Braden's smirk suggested this was merely an opening salvo. "Literature helps us understand different perspectives and time periods," she replied calmly, turning to write the day's objectives on the whiteboard. "Harper Lee's novel addresses themes that remain relevant today." "Yeah, right," Colton chimed in, earning approving nods from his friends. "My dad says teachers just pick boring stuff to torture us. Says real education happens in the real world." Rowan continued writing, refusing to take the bait. She had learned during her MMA training that the first rule of conflict was to avoid it when possible. De-escalation and patience often proved more effective than immediate confrontation. The pattern continued for days. Braden would arrive late, slamming the door. He interrupted lessons with loud yawns and inappropriate comments, while Colton and Jackson amplified every disruption. "Miss Blackwell," Jackson announced during reading, "I think there's something wrong with my desk." He banged his textbook against the metal surface, creating rhythmic percussion that derailed everyone's concentration. "Please stop," Rowan requested steadily. "Others are trying to read." "Oh, sorry, teach," Jackson replied with mock sincerity. "Didn't realize you were so sensitive. Maybe get some earplugs." Other students watched these exchanges with morbid fascination. Some looked sympathetic, particularly Alexis Chen, a brilliant student who sat in front and often stayed after class to discuss literature. Others seemed amused, while few appeared uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Mr. David Kim, the athletic director next door, had noticed Rowan during faculty meetings. His kind eyes and genuine smile made her heart flutter. They had shared coffee twice, discussing lesson plans and their mutual love of hiking in the Rocky Mountains. Rowan treasured these conversations and the way David listened without judgment. The bullying escalated during the third week. Braden rearranged desks, creating obstacles that forced Rowan to navigate a maze to reach the board. He would accidentally drop textbooks when she spoke, creating loud crashes that made her jump. Once, he left a crude drawing on the whiteboard depicting a stick figure labeled "Teacher." being chased by larger figures labeled students. The real humiliation began during a lesson on symbolism. Rowan was explaining the significance of the mockingbird when Braden raised his hand with exaggerated politeness. "I was wondering if you could demonstrate how a mockingbird moves," he said with false innocence. "For visual learners like me." "I think the text description is sufficient," Rowan replied, sensing a trap. "Come on, teach," Colton added. "Show us how it flaps its wings." The class erupted in chants of "demonstrate, demonstrate," led by Jackson's rhythmic clapping. Rowan felt heat rising in her cheeks as 30 pairs of eyes focused on her, waiting to see if she would submit to their collective pressure. "We'll move on to the next chapter," she said firmly, but her authority had been undermined. The students sensed weakness, and Braden smiled like a predator who had identified wounded prey. The following day brought a new torment. Braden had obtained her personal cell phone number and began sending text messages during class. Her phone would buzz with messages like, "Your voice is putting me to sleep," and "When does this torture end?" Each notification caused her to glance at her desk, prompting knowing looks from his crew. During lunch, she approached the vice principal, but Mrs. Patterson seemed more concerned with maintaining order than addressing the root problem. "Have you tried building rapport with these students?" Mrs. Patterson asked, not looking up from paperwork. "Perhaps you could incorporate more contemporary examples." Rowan left, feeling more isolated. The administration's suggestion that she accommodate her tormentors rather than address their behavior sent a clear message about where support would come from: nowhere. The breaking point arrived on a Friday afternoon during 6th period. Autumn sun streamed through windows as Rowan attempted to lead a discussion about moral courage in literature. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Can anyone give me an example of moral courage from your own experience?" she asked. Braden's hand shot up. "Yeah, I got one. Sometimes it takes courage to tell a teacher when they're doing a terrible job." The class fell silent. Even Alexis looked up with concern. "That's not exactly what I meant," Rowan said carefully. "No, hear me out," Braden continued, standing up with theatrical flair. "Like, it takes real guts to tell someone they're boring, right?" He began walking toward the front, and Rowan instinctively stepped backward. Everyone noticed. Her retreat sent excitement through the class as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. "For example," Braden continued, now 3 feet from her, "someone might have the courage to say that this class is a waste of time and that you're probably the worst teacher in the school." Colton and Jackson were on their feet now, forming a semicircle around her desk. Other students remained seated but craned their necks to see better, phones already recording what they sensed would be a viral moment. "Please return to your seats," Rowan said, her voice finally showing strain. "Or someone might have the courage," Braden said, stepping closer, "to point out that your outfit looks like it came from a thrift store clearance rack." His friends laughed harshly. Rowan felt her face burning as she realized David Kim might hear the commotion next door. The thought of him witnessing her humiliation was almost unbearable. "That's enough," she said more firmly, but her voice cracked. "Is it though?" Braden asked, his tone becoming aggressive. "Because I think someone with real courage might even test just how much a person can take before they break." Before she could react, his hand shot out and grabbed the collar of her navy blouse. The thin fabric wasn't chosen for durability, and the sudden motion caused her to stumble backward against the whiteboard. "Let me go," she said, her voice steady, despite adrenaline now coursing through her veins. "What if I don't want to?" Braden replied, his grip tightening. "What if I think it might be interesting to see what happens when someone pushes back?" The classroom held its breath as his fingers began pulling at the delicate material. Rowan could hear the slight tearing sound as seams strained. In her peripheral vision, she saw students holding up phones, documenting what they assumed would be her complete humiliation. But something had changed in Rowan's demeanor. Her breathing had shifted from shallow panic to the deep, controlled rhythm she had practiced thousands of times in the dojo. Her stance, previously defensive and retreating, became balanced and centered. 8 years of training had conditioned her body to respond to physical threats with calm precision rather than fear. "I said let me go," she repeated, and this time her voice carried an edge that made several students look up from their phones. Braden either didn't notice the change or chose to ignore it. He was too committed to his public demonstration of dominance to recognize the danger he had stumbled into. "Make me," he said, giving her blouse another sharp tug that tore the fabric at the shoulder seam. The sound of ripping cloth was the last straw. Rowan's left hand moved with lightning speed, grasping Braden's wrist in a grip that immediately cut off circulation to his fingers. Simultaneously, her right hand struck his elbow at precisely the angle needed to break his grip on her clothing. The technique was called an inside wrist throw in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and Rowan executed it flawlessly. Braden's eyes widened in shock as his hand went numb and his arm was twisted behind his back in one fluid motion. Before he could react, she had stepped to his side and used his own momentum to guide him face first against the whiteboard. "What the hell?" Colton shouted, starting forward to help his friend. Rowan's head turned toward him with a look that stopped him cold. There was no anger in her expression, only a calm calculation that suggested she was 3 steps ahead of any move he might make. "I wouldn't," she said simply, and something in her tone convinced him to freeze in place. Braden struggled against the hold, but every movement only tightened Rowan's control. She had positioned his arm at the perfect angle to cause maximum discomfort without actual injury, a technique designed to subdue without permanently harming. "This is how this works," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the suddenly silent classroom. "You can apologize for grabbing me and tearing my shirt, or I can demonstrate some other techniques I learned during my 8 years of mixed martial arts training." The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Students who had been recording suddenly found themselves witnessing something far different from what they had expected. Instead of a helpless teacher being humiliated, they were watching a trained fighter exercising remarkable restraint. "You're crazy," Braden gasped, his face pressed against the board. "No," Rowan replied calmly. "I'm someone who chose to become a teacher because I believe in education and respect, but I'm also someone who won't be physically assaulted in her own classroom." Jackson made the mistake of trying to circle behind her while she was focused on Braden. Rowan's peripheral vision, honed by years of sparring against multiple opponents, caught the movement immediately. Without releasing her hold on Braden, she pivoted and delivered a precise back kick that caught Jackson in the solar plexus, doubling him over and sending him stumbling backward into a row of desks. The technique was called a Ushiro Geri in karate, and Rowan had practiced it thousands of times against heavy bags and focus mitts. She had pulled the kick significantly, using just enough force to wind him without causing lasting damage. "Anyone else?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room with the calm confidence of someone completely in control of the situation. The classroom had descended into absolute silence. Students who had been laughing moments earlier now stared in wide-eyed amazement at their transformed teacher. Phones continued recording, but the narrative had completely shifted from victim shaming to something approaching awe. "Here's what's going to happen," Rowan announced, still maintaining her hold on Braden. "You're going to apologize for touching me without permission and for destroying my property. Then you're going to sit down and participate in this class like the intelligent young man I know you can be." "This is assault," Braden wheezed, though his protest lacked conviction. "No," Rowan corrected. "Assault is what you did when you grabbed my clothing against my will. This is self-defense, and I have 30 witnesses who can testify that I used the minimum force necessary to protect myself." She was right, and everyone in the room knew it. The phone recordings would show clearly that she had only acted after being physically grabbed, and that her response, while surprising, had been precisely calibrated to stop the threat without causing unnecessary harm. "I'm going to release you now," she continued, "and you're going to return to your seat. If you choose to escalate this situation further, I'll be happy to demonstrate some of the submission techniques I learned in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Some of them are quite unpleasant." Slowly, she released the pressure on his arm and stepped back, giving him space to move while remaining ready to react if necessary. Braden straightened up, rubbing his wrist and staring at her with a mixture of shock and something that might have been respect. The door burst open as David Kim rushed in, having heard the commotion from next door. He took in the scene, Rowan standing calmly in the center of the room, Braden rubbing his arm, Jackson still catching his breath, and 30 students staring in stunned silence. "Is everything okay in here?" he asked, his eyes immediately finding Rowan's torn blouse and concerned expression. "Everything's fine now," she replied, smoothing down her hair and adjusting her torn clothing with dignity. "We were just having a discussion about personal boundaries and respect." David's athletic background allowed him to quickly assess what had happened. The way Rowan carried herself, the positioning of the students, and the atmosphere in the room told a clear story. His expression shifted from concern to something approaching admiration as he realized what he had missed. "Well," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "it sounds like an important lesson. I'll let you get back to it." As he left, Rowan heard him chuckling softly in the hallway. The sound made her heart flutter despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "Now then," she said, turning back to her class, "who can tell me about a character in literature who had to find the courage to stand up for themselves?" Alexis's hand shot up immediately. "Atticus Finch," she said, her voice filled with new respect. "He stood up for what was right even when everyone was against him." "Excellent example," Rowan replied, settling back into her teaching rhythm as if nothing unusual had happened. "What made his courage particularly noteworthy?" The class discussion that followed was the most engaged she had experienced since arriving at Lincoln High School. Students who had never participated before raised their hands with thoughtful questions and observations. Even Colton, though still wary, contributed a surprisingly insightful comment about moral integrity. Braden remained silent for the rest of the period, but he didn't cause any disruptions. He sat in his seat, occasionally touching his wrist and shooting glances at Rowan with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than hostility. When the bell rang, students filed out in unusual quiet, many of them looking back at their teacher with new eyes. The phone recordings were already being shared, but the narrative was not what Braden had intended. Instead of a humiliated teacher, they showed a competent professional defending herself with skill and restraint. Alexis lingered after the others had left, approaching Rowan's desk with obvious concern. "Miss Blackwell, are you okay?" she asked. That was incredible. I had no idea you knew martial arts." "I'm fine, thank you," Rowan replied, examining the tear in her blouse. "And yes, I've been training for several years. It's a hobby I don't usually discuss at work." "Will you get in trouble for what happened?" Rowan considered the question carefully. "I defended myself against a physical assault using reasonable force. The recordings will show that clearly. If anything, this might finally get the administration's attention about what's been happening in this classroom." Word spread through Lincoln High School faster than weekend party gossip. By day's end, several colleagues expressed support for her handling of the situation. Mrs. Patterson even acknowledged that sometimes students need to understand actions have consequences. Monday brought transformed classroom dynamics. Braden arrived on time and took his seat without fanfare. When Rowan began the lesson, he opened his textbook and followed along. The change wasn't dramatic, but the hostility had disappeared entirely. During lunch, he approached her desk while she graded papers. Miss Blackwell, he said quietly, I wanted to apologize for what happened Friday. I was way out of line. She studied his face for insincerity, but found none. Thank you, Braden. I appreciate that. I thought teachers would just pushover adults who couldn't do anything about troublemakers. Most teachers could do quite a lot, Rowan replied gently. We choose not to because we believe in education and positive reinforcement, but that doesn't mean we're helpless. Understanding passed across his features. How long have you been doing martial arts? 8 years. I started in college for confidence. It became much more. Why didn't you mention it before? Because I wanted to be known as a good teacher, not as someone who could fight. What happened Friday was self-defense, not a demonstration. For what it's worth, you are a good teacher. I was just too stupid to realize it. The conversation marked a turning point. Colton and Jackson, taking cues from their leader, also adjusted their behavior. The disruption ceased and actual learning began. David Kim had been watching these developments with growing interest. His respect for Rowan deepened after witnessing how she handled the crisis with both strength and wisdom. Their conversations became more frequent and personal. I have to admit, he said during coffee, I was impressed by your technique. That wrist control was textbook perfect. Rowan blushed. You know martial arts? I wrestled in college and still train occasionally. I recognize the professionalism in how you handled that situation. You could have really hurt him. That was never the goal, she said firmly. I just needed him to understand that boundaries exist and have consequences. The transformation extended beyond her classroom. Other students began treating Rowan with respect that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition of her competence and integrity. She hadn't become a bully. She had simply established that she wouldn't tolerate being bullied. 3 weeks later, Principal Morrison, Braden's uncle, pulled her aside. We've reviewed the recordings extensively. Your response was completely appropriate and professionally handled. My nephew needed that reality check. His grades are improving and his attitude has changed dramatically. You taught him that actions have consequences with remarkable skill. Spring semester brought new opportunities. Rowan's reputation as both an excellent educator and someone not to be underestimated had spread throughout the school. Students sought her advice, recognizing her as someone who possessed both wisdom and strength. Braden had become one of her most improved students. His essay on moral courage was among the best she'd received. I wrote about you, he admitted when she returned the graded paper with an A-. About me. About how it takes real courage to be patient with people who don't deserve it, but also to stand up for yourself when patience isn't enough. You could have gotten me expelled, but you chose to teach me instead. As the school year drew to a close, Rowan reflected on her journey from that first nervous morning to her current position as one of Lincoln High School's most respected educators. She had learned that standing up for herself didn't require abandoning her principles or becoming someone she wasn't proud of. David Kim had become a constant presence in her life, their relationship evolving from professional courtesy to genuine partnership. He admired her strength while appreciating her compassion. On the last day of school, Braden stopped by her classroom one final time. Miss Blackwell, you changed how I think about things. My dad always taught me that being strong meant pushing people around, but you showed me that real strength is knowing when not to push and when to push back. What will you remember most about this year? He thought for a moment. That you could have destroyed me that day, but you chose to help me instead. That's the kind of person I want to be, someone who has the power to hurt people, but chooses to help them instead. As summer break began, Rowan packed up her classroom with satisfaction she had never experienced before. She had faced her greatest professional challenge and emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident. The torn blouse still hung in her closet at home, a reminder of the day she learned that being gentle didn't mean being helpless, and that standing up for yourself was not only acceptable, but necessary. She had found the perfect balance between strength and compassion, authority and kindness, self-defense and restraint. Most importantly, she had discovered that true courage wasn't about never feeling afraid. It was about acting with integrity and purpose, even when fear was present. That lesson had transformed not just her classroom, but her entire understanding of what it meant to be both strong and good in a world that sometimes demanded both qualities at once.